Temuulen bent into the blizzard, one hand over his mouth and the other locked around a rope stiff with ice, as the wind shoved at him like a living thing. Somewhere ahead, a calf cried once, and then again, the sound thin and frightened, as if it were being pulled through a crack in the sky. He kept moving toward it, stumbling through the white, until the last haystack rose from the drift, half buried and leaning like a tired old man who had stood one winter too many. Temuulen pressed his gloved fingers into the frozen straw and felt the ache of defeat in its emptiness. Too little, too late. His herd was scattered somewhere beyond the storm, and every breath he drew felt borrowed from winter itself. He stared into the spinning darkness and whispered, almost to himself, "Winter did not begin today, it began months ago." Then the calf cried again, closer this time, and Temuulen turned toward it with fear burning in his chest. How had they gotten here? The storm swallowed the answer, and summer flashed back. Summer on the steppe looked endless, as if the earth had opened its palms and offered green grass, blue sky, and silence all at once. Temuulen rode beside the herd with his younger cousins, trying to sound older than 17, trying to stand straighter, trying to speak with the confidence of a boy who believed the season would be kind. Their ger stood small against the horizon, and behind it sat their hay store, thinner than it should have been, though Temuulen did not want to admit it. Saruul noticed, however. She always did. She was his grandmother, small-backed but steady-eyed, with hands that remembered every hard winter the land had ever sent and every lesson the wind had taught her. Temuulen loved the bright weeks of summer and trusted that rain would come before the grass failed. Saruul trusted hope too, but she trusted the sky less. To her, grass was a green promise, hay was stored sunlight, and the sky was a warning still keeping its mouth shut. One evening, as the sun lowered over the steppe, she stopped beside the riverbank, touched the dust-dry wind, and said nothing, even though the waterline had already begun to shrink. Temuulen did not yet understand the fear in her silence, but the land had already started to change. And then, by the third week, the sky became a lie. Clouds drifted overhead, pale and harmless looking, but they gave nothing. The rain never came. Day after day, the grass snapped beneath the herd's hooves, brittle as old bone, and each step sent up a dry puff of dust that clung to the animal's legs. Temuulen began to notice what the herd noticed first: ribs sharpening beneath coats, calves lagging behind their mothers, one mare pausing longer and longer at the empty basin where water used to gather. At the wells, the neighbors spoke less, and when they did speak, their voices had changed. Even the strongest men kept glancing at the horizon, as if they could see winter riding toward them on the wind. Yet Temuulen still told himself there was time. He told himself the land would recover when the season turned, that a hard summer did not always mean a hard winter. But Saruul watched the same fields with a face that grew quieter each day. She knelt once to lift a handful of grass, rubbed it between her fingers, and let the dust fall back to the earth. That night, as they sat near the ger, she spoke at last and said a Dzud was never only snow. It was winter fed by a failed summer, hunger hidden in the heat, loss planted long before the first frost. She remembered another year when families waited too long, and when the snow came, their animals had nothing left to eat. Temuulen stared out at the thinning herd and hoped for rain. Saruul only said, "You do not wait for winter to prepare for winter." So she led him behind the ger to the low storage cellar, where the fodder pile looked smaller in daylight than it ever had in memory. She lifted the top bundle and showed him how much empty space remained under the tarps. "This is what we have," she said, her voice calm but firm. "So we act now." And because there was no arguing with the land, Temuulen began to work. Together they gathered every usable blade of hay from the yard, shook out the dry pieces, and stacked them higher and tighter, wrapping them against wind and moisture with old tarps, ropes, and whatever else they could spare. At first, Temuulen worked in silence, embarrassed by how urgently Saruul moved. But the more he carried, the more he understood that her urgency was not panic, it was memory. It was respect for what the steppe could do if ignored. Then Saruul took him to the winter pen, and they patched the walls with reed mats, packed the gaps with cloth, and hammered boards over the places where the north wind had begun to slip through. Inside, they spread warm bedding and made room for the weakest animals first, not the strongest, because survival had to start somewhere sensible. Soon, when the neighbors saw the work, they came with tools, extra hands, and practical words. One family lent a sled, another shared wire, and another brought dried dung for fuel. And before long, the whole slope was moving as if one heartbeat had passed through them all. Temuulen watched the haystack rise into a tall, safe mound, and for the first time he understood what Saruul meant. Preparedness was not fear, it was love that moved before regret. So they set aside emergency fodder in a dry corner, sealed it from the weather, and kept a sheltered space ready before the first freeze arrived. By sunset, the new haystack stood against the sky like a golden tower of insurance, bright and patient, waiting for winter before winter could arrive. Then the first snow fell softly, turning the steppe silver and quiet. For a breathless moment, the children laughed and held out their hands, as if winter had come to bless them. Even Temuulen almost smiled, because the flakes looked gentle, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed clean again. But by morning, the temperature had dropped like a stone. The snow hardened into crusted ice over the grass, sealing the pasture beneath a glassy shell that the animals could not break. The herd nosed at the ground, huffing and circling, but their hooves slipped and scraped uselessly. Wind whipped across the plain, sharp enough to sting the eyes and split the lips. Temuulen stood frozen for a moment, and understood at last that the danger was not the snow itself, but the ice hiding the food beneath it. He looked towards the shelter, then towards the hay reserve, and felt his heart tighten. One weak mare staggered, nearly falling. Beyond her, the storm swallowed the horizon whole. No one spoke. Even the dogs crouched low, ears flat, as if they feared the white silence ahead. Temuulen knew the true test had begun.
When the whiteout thickened, it seemed to erase not only distance, but direction, sound, and thought. Temuulen could barely see Saruul's hand in front of his face, yet together they fought through the storm, shouting at the herd, pushing the weakest animals toward the shelter, and trying not to lose count of anything that still breathed. Then a fence snapped beneath the wind with a crack like breaking bone, and one calf slipped from the line, vanishing into the snow. Temuulen lunged after it, heart hammering so hard it hurt, but the storm erased the tracks almost instantly. Panic rose in him like fire. He thought of every delayed day, every time he had believed there was still time, every moment he had doubted Saruul's warnings, and every small sign he had chosen not to see. When he finally found the calf, trembling and half-buried, he understood the cruel truth. Some animals would not make it. Grief hit harder than fear, and for a moment he could not tell whether the tears in his eyes were from the wind or from shame. Saruul reached him through the storm and held his shoulders until he could stand steady again. "Survival is not the same as perfection," she said. "You prepared, that is why the rest are still here." Behind them, the haystack glowed faintly through the storm, like a lighthouse in a white ocean, and the shelter stood like a hand cupped around the herd. They fed the animals from the reserve exactly as planned, rationing each bundle, moving calmly because panic would only waste what they had saved. Then by dawn, a neighboring family arrived with 2 sacks of fodder, and together they shared what remained, saving the animals that still had a chance. Temuulen looked over the quiet, battered herd and whispered, "The winter took what we could not protect, but it did not take our will to rebuild." Saruul nodded, already gathering ropes, because morning, even after a storm like that, would still demand work. When spring finally came, it did not arrive with celebration. It came slowly, loosening the ice, softening the frozen steppe, and turning the white ground into mud and then into dark earth. The survivors were thinner, their coats rougher, and their movements slower, but they were alive. No one pretended otherwise. The village counted losses with honest faces and quiet voices, because survival did not erase sorrow, and grief did not disappear just because the snow had melted. Temuulen worked beside Saruul, repairing fences, mending the winter shelter, and gathering hay weeks earlier than before. This time he moved with purpose, not delay, and when younger herders watched him, he taught them what Saruul taught him: prepare early, store feed, protect the weakest animals first, and make a plan before the weather makes one for you. The neighbors copied the habit, and that mattered more than any speech. Extra hay was stacked under cover, broken walls were fixed before the wind could return, tools were shared before they were needed in desperation. Bit by bit, the village began to look harder to break. They were not only recovering now, they were learning how to stand better next time. By sunset, the new haystack rose taller, the pen stood stronger, and the whole family worked together in a calm, steady rhythm. Under the clearing sky, Temuulen smiled, because fear had become useful memory now. And as summer returned, Temuulen stood on the edge of the steppe and watched fresh grass move like waves beneath the wind. Beside the older reserve, he stacked new hay with careful hands, remembering the winter, the silence, the hunger, and the lesson hidden inside them all. The first rescue happens before the snow. Disasters are natural, but the size of their loss is shaped by what people do before they arrive. Resilience grows in ordinary seasons, in quiet work done while the sky is still clear. Nearby, a child tied the last bundle of hay as Saruul smiled softly, her eyes on the horizon. The wind crossed the plain, no longer threatening, only reminding.